Former President Trump hit the campaign trail over the weekend with stops in key early voting states of New Hampshire and South Carolina. He says he's, quote, more angry and committed, end quote, to winning back the White House than ever. And then he took aim at his potential Republican challengers.
So Ron would have not been governor if it wasn't for me. And then when I hear he might run, I consider that very disloyal. Talked to her for a little while. But I said, look, go by your heart if you want to run. She's publicly stated I would never run against my president. He was a great president.
Let's bring in now Ron Brownstein, CNN senior political analyst and senior editor for The Atlantic. Also with us, political commentator and Republican strategist Alisyn Stewart. Good to have both of you. Alisyn, let me start with you. Clearly, he is going after who he thinks is the biggest threat, and that's Ron DeSantis. Polls would suggest that he's probably on target with that. DeSantis doesn't need to get into the race, but does he need to respond to this? Do you think any of these kind of early swipes are landing?
Well, speaking from experience with a candidate who is on the receiving end of Donald Trump's threat, generally the best response is no response, because he will just continue to punch and attack. And clearly what we're seeing is that Donald Trump seems to think that any of these potential 2024 candidates owe a pledge to him and not a pledge to the United States of America. And he's going to be in for a rude awakening. And two things are certain about Donald Trump. If you are irrelevant, he will ignore you. And if you are threatening, he will target you. And that's exactly what he's doing with Ron DeSantis. He sees the polls. He sees that DeSantis is ahead in the key state of New Hampshire. He's closing the gap in a lot of these national polls. And he's also hearing from a lot of donors and fundraisers within the Republican Party who have said enough of Donald Trump. There are plenty of candidates out there that will espouse the policies of Donald Trump, but will not bring about the dumpster fire that Donald Trump brings. And they're looking to turn the page, and they're looking elsewhere. And Donald Trump is going to see a very crowded field very soon.
Ron, I can imagine that it would be hard for Governor DeSantis to ignore this in particular, because Donald Trump is going after his record on COVID, which Governor DeSantis prides himself on. So he sees him as, he's calling him disloyal and calling him sort of a charlatan on COVID. So here's that moment.
I mean, I had governors that decided not to close their state. Florida was actually closed for a very long period of time. Remember, he closed the beaches and everything else. They're trying to rewrite history. It's sometimes hard to do. So then when I hear he might run, I consider that very disloyal, but it's not about loyalty. But to me it is. It's always about loyalty.
Basically, it's hard to hear that, obviously, but it said that basically Governor DeSantis is trying to rewrite history because Florida was closed for a long time.
Yeah, and that, Alisyn, I think is really indicative of the dynamic that's going to develop, has developed already very quickly in the Republican race. I mean, the reason why so many of the donors and strategists and party leaders that Alice referred to prefer DeSantis over Trump is because they think DeSantis has a better chance than Trump of winning back those white-collar suburbs outside of Philadelphia and Detroit and Georgia and Atlanta and Phoenix and even Milwaukee that proved dispositive in the 2020 race that cost the Republicans 2020 and was a large reason why they didn't do so well as they expected in 2022. But the dynamic that's already developing is that each Trump and DeSantis, to the extent they are dealing with each other, are each attacking each other from the right and pulling each other further to the right. And you see Trump there basically saying DeSantis wasn't right-wing enough in resisting COVID shutdowns. You've had DeSantis saying that Trump was too conceding to the biomedical state by promoting the vaccine. You had Trump last week put out this really striking extreme education agenda that had language like pink-haired communists as teachers in an attempt to outflank DeSantis on kind of the woke ideology attacks that DeSantis is doing. And DeSantis at some point will respond to that, presumably with even more aggressive measures. So you can see right away that the initial dynamic is not DeSantis trying to pivot off Trump and maybe make himself think about the general election. But I think they are both kind of be in this kind of tumble over each other to kind of outflank each other on the right. And that obviously has big implications for whichever one, if either, wins the nomination.
Alice, let's talk about this large field you're hoping for and listen to New Hampshire Governor Sununu here now in his fourth term.
Oh, I don't have a timeline. I mean, obviously folks are talking about it, but I really don't have a timeline. I'm spending a lot of time nationally trying to grow the party as Republicans. talk to independents, talk to the next generation of potential Republican voters that right now no one is really reaching out to.
You're considering it?
Yes.
So he's considering getting in. Is he one of the non-Trump and really non-Trump affiliated, didn't serve in the administration, voices who could be a formidable challenge to the former president?
He certainly could, and he's certainly more moderate on the social issues and conservative on the fiscal issues, which is a good lane to be in. We all know that Donald Trump, you have to give him credit, he has a very strong, solid base, but we need to grow on that. We need to bring in the disaffected independents as well as Republicans that we've lost due to his tone and tenor. And there are many candidates that can do just that. And the key is to get out there and work on your name ID, get out on as much television as you possibly can, and go to these early states and talk with people and shake their hands. People like Sununu, there are many others, Nikki Haley, Asa Hutchinson, Mike Pompeo. What they're doing is they're going to these early states and they're talking with the key people in these states, and they're working to develop a grassroots, and they're also working to test the waters with regard to fundraising numbers. And there's a big space out there for someone who is Trump's policies without the tone and tenor, and that's the important thing. We need to look past just who's going to win the Republican primary, but who can actually win a general election, and that's what Republicans are looking at.
I thought it was very interesting, Ron, that he doesn't appear to fear Donald Trump's wrath, and I'll just paraphrase it for you in the interest of time. He said that Donald Trump came to New Hampshire and frankly gave a very mundane speech. He stuck to his teleprompter, he stuck to his talking points, then he went away. He didn't bring that fire, that energy, and I think it was a little disappointing to some folks. I mean, that's somebody who doesn't sound like he's afraid of blowback from Donald Trump.
Right. And in fact, he was right. I mean, the speech was kind of low energy, like the original announcement speech, kind of making you wonder, how much Donald Trump's heart is in this. Look, if Sununu gets in the race, what it does is devalue the importance of New Hampshire. And that tilts the balance in the Republican primary. You have those first three states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. In Iowa and South Carolina, about 2/3 of the Republican primary voters, or even more in South Carolina, are evangelical Christians. New Hampshire's the offset to that, where you have more of the voters that Alice was talking about who are fiscally conservative, but socially more moderate. Only about 1/4 of the voters in New Hampshire are evangelical Christians. If the sitting governor runs, New Hampshire gets less attention, just guaranteed, and has less impact on the outcome of the race. And so that kind of tilts the balance more actually paradoxically toward the social conservatives. And also, Sununu is indicative of the problem that the Trump opponents have. We know that he's much less popular among college-educated Republicans than among blue-collar Republicans. The problem is that in 2016, even though he only won about 1/3 of those college Republicans, the rest never coalesced behind one candidate. They splintered behind Cruz and Rubio and Jeb for a while and Kasich. And the risk, again, is that you have a lot of candidates potentially eyeing that lane. Sununu, Hogan, Tim Scott if he runs, Nikki Haley if she runs, and certainly that would have to be the core for a DeSantis challenge. So divide and conquer could be Trump's friend again in 24 as it was in 16, even though I would say DeSantis has a better chance of consolidating the anti-Trump part of the party than anyone did what it would be 7 years ago.
Which is also why Governor Sununu said, yeah, get in, but also know when to get out of the race as well.
Yeah.
Don't stay too long if you can't get that support. Yeah.
Ron, Alice, thank you both